Zoanthids are one of my favorite types of corals because they come in such a wide variety of shapes and colors. And today I'm going to tell you guys everything you need to know to care for them. Now, the biggest thing is that Zoanthids and Palythoas can be broken up into a few different groups, but they're all going to have relatively the similar care. So the first group is going to be Zoanthids. These are typically what you think of. They're very colorful, and there's a lot of different varieties. Some of my favorites are the Space Chaos Zoa, the Eagle Eye Zoa, or the Radioactive Dragon Eyes. The next group is going to be Palythoas. Those are things like the Purple People Eaters, the Captain Jerk Pallies. The next group and final, that is definitely one of my favorite, is Grandis Pallies. Now these get very large and they typically don't grow as quickly as Zoanthids and Pallies, but what they do is get a lot bigger. So these guys can be as big as 10 times the size of Zoanthids. And what that means is they take a lot longer to grow. Grandis Pallies are going to be the least talked about and the most uncommon variety, and there's not a ton of different color variations. There's some greens, some brownish purples, and then a few that mix the two colors together. But overall, there's only a few types, and there isn't really a ton to them. They're going to be very similar in care to the other Zoas and Pallies we're talking about. Now, the next groups are Zoas and Pallies, as I said. And Pallies are going to grow a lot faster. That's going to be the main distinction. They'll usually have longer tentacles, or what's sometimes referred to as lashes, and they'll also usually be a lot thinner. Now, this distinction between Zoanthids and Pallies is a little bit loose, but overall, the basics are that Zoanthids are going to be a lot smaller, and as I said, have those shorter tentacles, and the Pallies are usually going to be a lot bigger, usually around the size of a dime. And then they're going to have tentacles that are a lot longer. And the biggest difference, again, is that they grow a lot faster. So a lot of times when you look at the back glass of some of our systems, you'll see a bunch of Zoas, or in this case, Pallies growing on there. Those are usually Pallies because they grow so fast that they end up just getting out of control. Usually with these guys, what I recommend is placing them on their own separate rock because they can tend to take over a tank and grow all over some of your other corals. And because the Pallies are a little bit bigger, what will happen a lot of times if you mix them with some of your Zoanthids is they end up growing over them and shadowing your Zoas that are usually a lot more desirable because of their color variations and patterns. So it's overall better to keep your Pallies separate and self-contained on their own little rock, or not introduce them at all and simply stick to just Zoas or just Pallies in your system. Now, no matter what kind of Zoa or Pallie you're looking at, they're all going to typically like lower to moderate lighting with PAR anywhere from 50 to about 150 and flow on the lower end, usually where they're lightly waving or not really moving at all, just enough so that you don't get detritus sitting on top of the Zoanthids because that can disturb them and cause them not to grow very well. One thing you can do with Zoas that is really cool is make what's called a Zoa garden, and that's where you glue a bunch of different color varieties onto one rock or one tile, and they'll actually grow together, especially if they're all around the same size and shape, and create this really cool mosaic where you have a bunch of different colors, and it really looks like it's all one rainbow growing in together. Now, Zoas and Pallies usually like their water a little bit dirtier, so when it comes to nitrates, I usually recommend shooting for anywhere from 5 to 50 ppms, and for phosphates, anywhere from 0.03 to about 1 ppm. What that means is if you do too many water changes or keep your water a little too clean, either by not feeding enough or, as I said, over water changing your system, your Zoas can tend to shrink and not show as good color as they should. And usually I keep these systems a little bit elevated in their nutrients by feeding things like Reef Energy AB+, and powdered foods like Reefroids. Now what that does is not only directly increase my nitrates and phosphates, but it also gives the coral direct access to that food and usually ends up allowing them to process those nutrients a lot easier. And because it's in that form of direct food, they can usually end up having lower nutrients, which can help with algae control. It is important to not overfeed these foods and make sure that most of the food is getting eaten and not just floating into your filter. And the best way to do that is to shut off your pumps when you're about to feed, and starting with a small amount of food and slowly increasing that as you continue to feed your corals. Now this goes for all corals, but especially for Zoanthids. They really are going to enjoy eating and do very well if you feed them pretty frequently. if you're not feeding them as much, they can definitely still grow, but if you don't have the nutrients where you need them to be, they can tend to stagnate a little bit and get a little bit duller in color. Now, one of my biggest tips for Zoa coloration is making sure that you have the proper lighting and nutrition. There are some Zoas that will get more vivid in lower light, but typically the lower light will give them less color, but a bigger polyp, and the higher light will give them more color. Now, one thing you can do is you can feed them if they're in that lower light, and that will sometimes make up for the lower lighting with the added nutrition of the food, allowing them to not only have a larger polyp, but also have some really great coloration. But one thing to remember is that you don't want to overfeed your tank because it can lead to a spike in nutrients, which isn't necessarily a bad thing unless it happens too quickly. That can cause a chain reaction where you can start to lose a lot of different stuff. So I always recommend feeding a small amount to start off with and slowly increasing the amount you feed. I also recommend turning off your pumps so it doesn't just flow into your filter sock or your sponge and then end up breaking down there and just adding to the bioload rather than actually nourishing your corals. So for instance, this white zombie Zoa colony behind me, as you can see, towards the center of the colony, it's gonna have a lot more of the whitish blue coloration to it, and then around the edges, it has a little bit more of that darker purple. Now that's what I was saying earlier, with that higher light in the center, it gets a little bit more of that vivid coloration, and then towards the edges where it's getting shaded a little bit and has a little bit less direct lighting, you get a little bit more dull coloration and more of a mix between the two colors that it displays. We also have a detailed feeding video that you guys can check out up there, where we go through how exactly we feed our Zoas and some tips for you guys on feeding yours at home. One important thing to note is something called palytoxin. Palytoxin is a neurotoxin, and it's actually the second deadliest in the world. So it's very important to be cautious when you're handling Zoanthids and Palys, because they can actually secrete this palytoxin. Now, palytoxin isn't really something you need to worry about unless you're handling these Zoas without some sort of gloves or protection on. I typically recommend, especially with Palys because they release it a lot easier, to wear some type of glove when you're handling them, and especially if you're doing any sort of fragging, to make sure you're wearing the proper personal protective equipment. This includes, for me, a mask, glasses, as well as gloves, just to make sure that I don't get any palytoxin anywhere on me. I've known several people who have gotten palytoxin poisoning, and it varies from a slight rash all the way up to having seizing attacks and ending up with a lot of pain and ending up needing to go to the hospital. So it's very important to take care when you're handling Zoanthids, and it's important that you wear personal protective equipment such as gloves when you're handling these animals. If you're going to be fragging these guys, I definitely recommend wearing gloves, a mask, as well as goggles to make sure that you don't get any of the palytoxin into your bloodstream. That's when you can experience the poisoning. But as long as they're in your tank, they can't really cause you any harm. It's really just when they're outside of the tank and being handled. Now, Zoanthids are soft corals, and what that means is that they don't have a skeleton, and so they won't consume nutrients like calcium and alkalinity. It is important that you don't have a wide swing, especially in something like alk, because that swing can definitely irritate the corals and can cause them to actually die and melt. So it's important to maintain stable levels, but they aren't going to consume it. And so you typically, if you just have Zoanthids and Palys, you don't need to dose your tank for those guys. If you do have other hard corals like LPS and SPS, you are going to need to dose for them. And it's important you keep an eye on how those parameters go, so that way you don't cause a spike or a sharp drop and thus irritate your soft corals as well. While most Zoas and Palys are going to have the same care level, there are a few minute differences between a few of the different subspecies. So primarily, if you see very small polyps on something like an AOI Zoa, which is a smaller polyp Zoa typically, they can be a little more finicky and tend to melt, especially if you frag them. So it's best to make sure that these guys are nicely encrusted on their plug and have at least a couple different polyps before you purchase them, because they are more susceptible to stress, especially shipping or moving, and can a lot of times either float off the plug or just not do very well in your system. When it comes to diseases and pests with zoanthids, there's a few different things you need to look out for. Generally, if your zoas stay pretty consistently closed or don't look super happy and open all the way, or you start to disappear or miss polyps, it's good to start to look for pests. And there's a few more common ones that you'll see pretty often, especially if you're getting in a lot of zoas like we do. One of the most common, especially in the hobby, these typically don't come in on wild zoas, but they do appear in the hobby, is going to be zoapox. This is a disease where there's white spots all over zoas. It's basically an infection that causes the zoas to die over time. But the tricky thing with this is they usually look perfectly fine, happy, and open for a while. And it's not until you get the zoas to close up that you can actually see the pox infestation. And it'll take them a while before they start to not do well. Now, another big pest that we see a lot, especially from wild zoas, is going to be zoa-eating nudibranchs. Now, these guys are actually pretty cool looking. They'll absorb the color of the zoanthid. So if they are on a green zoanthid, they'll actually get green coloration on them. So they'll actually look pretty cool, but it is a very harmful pest that can definitely wipe out your zoas. For this, I recommend doing a dip when you get your zoas. We treat ours primarily with iodine and Coral RX. Coral RX is going to be my favorite dip. You guys can learn more about dipping in our coral dipping video. The other common pest that you want to definitely keep an eye out for is zoa-eating spiders. These two are the biggest and most common pests, and really the only ones you're likely to see. The zoa-eating spiders, similar to the nudies, will basically just, as the name implies, eat your zoas and slowly cause them to die and disintegrate and even start to melt until they're completely wiped out. The treatment for these guys is very similar. It's good to just remove them from the tank, dip them. If you're able to, put them in a quarantine tank. If not, you can just remove them from your tank, dip them every 1 to 2 weeks to make sure that you kill any, because the dip, while it will kill and remove adults, will not actually kill the eggs. So after a couple weeks, those eggs will hatch again, and you need to kill them before they become mature and able to lay more eggs. So a lot of times people will just do one dip and think they killed them all, and then a couple weeks later when the eggs hatch, they start having problems again and they can't really figure it out. So it's definitely important to keep in mind that these guys do require consistent dipping. And really the best thing to look for when you get a new zoa is any sort of adults on there, or any signs of irritation or bite marks that these guys will leave. You can see sometimes chunks out of the zoas, and it's good to close them up so you can see those a lot easier. Same thing with zoapox. The best way to inspect these guys really is when they're all closed up with some sort of light, so that way you can really get in the crevices and inspect your frags properly. Now, we do pretty rigorous dipping here, but no matter where you get your corals from, I recommend always dipping. I've even got corals from hobbyists who have farm tanks and things like that, and I've still gotten pests from them. So it's definitely good, no matter where you get your corals from, to maintain dipping protocols to ensure that your tank doesn't get infested with any sort of pests or disease. Overall, zoas are very hardy and one of the best beginner corals to start with, and definitely one of my favorites because they come in such a wide variety of colors. So they make a really great starter coral, not only because they're so easy, but also because they can add so much vibrance to your aquarium. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you guys did, make sure to leave a like below, leave a comment with what your favorite zoa is, and make sure to subscribe so you guys stay up to date with all of our different care videos, our beginner series, as well as a bunch of other videos where we do a bunch of other cool stuff. And I will see you guys in the next one.